I'm with KU Leuven and the University of Vienna, and I'm actually really excited to discuss this work that I did, and in the last parts also with Kathrin Gerling on like media theory and play, and specifically how the surrogate body theory from immersion theory in cinema translates to game contexts. And I'm really sorry, but I kind of also want to break the format. It took me 5 years to get to those thoughts. Maybe I'm also just slow, but like I feel it profits more from an interactive thing. So if you have a question, ask it right away. The talk fits its mold of time that it has. That also probably means we have to be like a little bit more attentive, but it's going to be fine. So the surrogate body theory comes from media studies, and particularly, as I said, film studies, and Voss developed it to understand cultural and mediated immersion in movies, particularly the cinema. And, well, distilled into one quite long sentence, the theory says that immersion happens when a viewer lends their affective and emotional responses to the film by embodying them, leading to a metaphorical body that is made up of the intersubjective interplay between viewers and film, and then facilitated through a physical aesthetic distance. It's super complex. But I went literally to the drawing board, and I tried to figure out what this means. Like, where is that surrogate body? What do people do? What is that distance? And as you can see here, they don't do a lot in cinema. The affective response, I mean, it can be outward when you feel something that you feel through the movie, but the screen is really far away, or the screen. And it has to bridge this large distance, and the embodied reactions are also really limited. It's like similar to here. You have like this constrained space, and also there are like not just the chair and the seating options, but there are also social expectations from viewers. I mean, everybody has been in cinema, like shh. So there is like limits of how much you can express your emotional response. But it's not the same for every context. This context is a little different, although it has like parallels to cinema. And here we have a giant picture of Kathrin that I promised months ago on Twitter, presenting a paper remotely at a conference. And yeah, the dispositive is like the context is pretty cinematic, but the interaction differs. People can exert some control of what happens on the screen by asking questions. And games put that further, don't they? So Voss is the main person behind the theory, and she's at the University of Weimar, where I studied before, and a while ago. And for the last 5 years, I've been quite angry, actually, about one particular footnote of that theory development, in which she claims that games and digital media to be essentially equivalent to cinematic dispositives. And I was like, really? So let's talk about what this means for a very stereotypical gamer image context at a personal computer setup. I mean, we still have a screen, multiple in this case. But suddenly, the surrogate body is located and expressed through two positions on the player. It not only lends affective response and emotional response, players also lend their actions to the game. So given that this tends to be at least physically, often solitary and private activity, emotional responses are not as regulated as well as in social contexts like the cinema. And they can technically be more expressive, but that has consequences for gameplay. If you stand up and are yelling or something, you do not have your hands on the controller anymore, and that has consequences for that interaction. So players not only lend emotions, they also lend actions. And that is different in other types of games. Like here we have a Wii or a Kinect, In the we case, you still have a controller in hand and the connect not necessarily. But suddenly your entire body is a mirror image of the surrogate body. It is fully lent to that context, and any action you do might have consequences. Like, as long as you keep your hands there, if you play on a desktop computer, you can still be like, whoa. But if you do that in like a game that like looks at you back, so to speak, that has consequences then as well. So emotional responses, and we didn't even go that far, but like emotional responses also become actions that are lent to the game and to that surrogate body. So yeah, and that also means that displays of affect suddenly can also become like not just like the immersive experience, but also fundamentally points of disruption. I mean, I'm there for the disruption, but I'm also pointing it out. And it also has implications for ways of knowing in games. The more associated certain contexts are with things we could feasibly also do outside of games or outside of digital games, this becomes like a way of engaging with embodied knowledge. Like here, the player can draw from an experience of fishing in carnival games, while also practicing this action for potentially different non-digital contexts, but in this case, I kind of like oppose that, because that's my child. So the embodied experiences of players play an additional role in how they lend their body and their actions to the surrogate body. I warned you, it's a lot. And then we call this embodied play, and I'm going to trouble that in a second, but if we look at embodied play, where you lend your entire body even more to that surrogate body and to the game environment and are determined by that game environment and how you act and how you move and how you are with the game, as you see here in head-mounted VR to the left, or even like you might even suspend some sensory perceptions in that context. And like the sensory perceptions of your physical environment become overridden by like the game environment, like when you see, for example, but also like by holding these controllers, there's some haptic feedback that isn't there, like that isn't available to the physical environment. So basically with my starting point of being annoyed that games were described as fundamentally the same to cinema, and troubling that and being like, yeah, no, that is much more complex. Because you lend actions to the surrogate body as well as affect. I repeat that a lot. And that these contexts and in-games are also hugely diverse across different play scenarios. We're good. Which we then also can understand as embodied. It becomes more, like every play experience then becomes more fully embodied, and that like is what I mean with when we say we have embodied play and non-embodied play, but if we take this theory, every play act becomes embodied. So bringing this into play didn't just mean we were able to like extend that theory, but it also helped us understand more about what it means to have a body in play. And the paper goes deeper and has a fancy table, and hopefully helpfully more on background theory, and is just tremendously more nuanced. But like I say, more nuanced, but like there is more work to do, and I'm totally happy to talk with people about that. So, yeah. And while I was preparing the talk, I was asked whether I'm drawing my presentation, and my answer was just no, I drew my paper, because you find all of these figures in the paper as well. Besides making the point that I just made, like with theories and with like lending affect, but also lending embodied actions to a given game context, we're also trying to make a point about knowing beyond textual engagements, but knowing through drawing, because I started seriously engaging with that at the point where I was able to understand the cinema theory in a way that I could draw on it and then develop and iterate over certain contexts. So I'm also arguing for a methodological diversity in terms of like engaging with very different ways of knowledge construction. But if you're interested in more of my textual work, it's just like in 15 minutes, and then we'll talk about that game that you don't see. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. I really think it's great that that kind of more critical theories are represented at Kai Play, which is really exciting. Do we have any questions from the audience? I think it's a lot to digest.
Danielle Wild, University of Southern Denmark. Katta, thank you. I don't know, you might hate me for this question, but I want to ask what you think the people in this room and in this community who make games and interrogate the act of making games as they're making them and through making them, what they can take away from this in their actual making and doing an embodied engagement with the construction of games and the researching, the act of researching, embodied act of researching them.
So we do have some guidelines, but the main takeaway that I would like to see is that people think more about the embodiment of the context, because right now, on the one hand, in design, it seems a little bit opportunistic in terms of like, what is that new technology and what kind of like let's just do another Switch game and like put the Goose Game on Switch, even though it might not necessarily be the experience that they even want from an embodied perspective. Like it's a lens shifting in how you also try to like acknowledge the sorry, I talk like that. Acknowledge the technological dispositive of like what that means for the play experience more holistically, because what we dominantly do is also then like look at questionnaires or like do interviews, but that is all textual, and we are trying to like argue for getting a little bit away from that and like looking at other qualities and engaging with media theory in that context in a way to also try to understand aspects that we not necessarily are able to verbalize, but that we should think about.
Thank you.
Dees Postma, University of Twente. First off, compliments to your artwork. It looks really, really nice. I have a question, and I'm not sure whether it's a good one, so stay tuned.
All questions are good ones.
Sorry?
All questions are good ones.
Well...
I'm gonna love it, I promise.
All right, so am I correct when I say that, in your opinion, VR games are more embodied than sitting behind a desktop playing a game?
Well, correct is not the word that I would use. No, I'm saying it's a different type of embodiment if you ask from my perspective, but there can be different interpretations, and I kind of like the space where it's not clear, but where we actually use that then as a mode of reflection. So I would say desktop games are just differently embodied because the affordance is that you have your hands there and cannot, and have the restriction there. But then if you have VR games with a controller, there's also like a limitation in how you can move in that space and what kind of embodied reactions are possible and what that means. So in the paper, we go into detail what that means for affect and what that means for actions. Maybe that's then more helpful.
Could you maybe
there is another
say a little bit
question
about that?
Okay, good. I just
Yeah, you said there's in the paper there's more about that, but I'm already curious right now. So, could you tell me a little bit about it already, or is that too much?
No, have it open. More like to check if I forgot something. But no. So I have a giant table. That's my fancy table. Well, so there we go. Yeah, that's okay. There is a lot there. I think it takes a little bit more time than we have, and I have another talk to get nervous about. So but I'm happy to talk later more.
I would love to. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next up, we have software engineering practices and methods in the game development industry.